Good morning and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me. It's a real pleasure for me to meet with you, especially with people who are very versed in human rights and who have great experience. So I would suggest for our debate after presentation to make a tour de table, so everybody can speak very briefly about three things. After 75 years of the United Nations, how you see the key achievement in human rights at the global level, of course, the key gaps and what needs to be done. These three questions briefly, and then we will pass to the presentations of everybody, individual presentation, and then we will focus on the three issues of our debate. So if you are okay, we can start this way.
Great.
Can you repeat what the three questions were, or the three things we were starting with?
Yeah, it was initially they were four, but we've used the question one and question two. Question one is how can the streamlining of the monitoring system of human rights could be enhanced, and we added to that, could the elevation of the status of Human Rights Council be a solution or an option? The second one will be, to what extent can the conditionality of human rights in strategic economic partnerships be an incentive to human rights promotion and protection? So as a condition for good partnerships, etc. So it will be mainstreamed in economic cooperation, etc. And the third question is, what could be the innovative mechanisms that can be contemplated to better protect human rights, especially for vulnerable people? I mean, like women, children, disabled persons, etc. So the first one is with improving the architecture to make it more effective. The second one, in terms of international cooperation, could the conditionality of human rights could be an incentive or not? And the third one is the better or the best mechanisms to include or to let vulnerable people especially benefit from the human rights regime globally and nationally. So I will introduce this debate very rapidly. As you know, the UN has launched this year what we call it the greatest or the largest discussion all over the world to mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and it's the biggest exercise of listening to people. The UN for this year tried to take a moment to listen to people everywhere in the world. So, and the results of this listening took many forms. There is a form of a 1-minute survey that online for everybody, individuals, to talk about the UN and to express what they think about the UN and the future of the UN. Almost around 1 million contributed in this survey, and also there is polling by independent opinion polls carried out by two organizations for the UN to see what people think about the UN, and also there was an exercise of through artificial intelligence of analyzing the social media and traditional media in 50 countries to try to have an idea of what people think about the UN, how people expect the UN to be, etc. So the results of this exercise of listening was, published or declared to the public on September 21st by the Secretary General at the special session of the General Assembly, and this was to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Charter. The results are online, and what is surprising is that there were three key results, and the three results talk about healthcare, safe water, sanitation, solidarity, etc. All these, only one talks directly about human rights, which was the fifth. It says that other major priorities for the future include ensuring greater respect for human rights, settling conflicts, etc., etc. But all, if you see all the 10 key recommendations of people around the world, human rights are there in terms of especially economic and social rights, because as everybody has seen during this time of pandemic, we've seen that people who are the worst hit by the pandemic are people who are vulnerable, people who do not really enjoy their human rights in terms of socio-economic human rights, especially in population in slums, population in poor countries, in poor areas, etc., were the most hit in terms, because they lack the basic access to basic services, especially to health. So in general, this pandemic was also an opportunity to discover that our world really needs a stronger action for people to have access to really basic human rights as health, education, etc. So I will not be long. So I will pass to the presentations, and then we'll ask each of you to try to answer in very briefly the three questions. What are the key achievements in human rights during the 75th 75th years? What are the key gaps you see, and what key suggestion you would like to make? And I will start by presenting my presentation. Excuse me, because I'm trying to take it from my emails. So I will present Mr. Khalid Ramli, who is Director of Cooperation and International Relations at the Moroccan National Human Rights Council. Mr. Khalid is a former fellow of the Office of the Human Rights, UN Human Rights Commissioner. Khalid is also a trainer. He holds a Master in Translation and Bachelor of Law. And then I will pass to present Ambassador Doru Costea. Ambassador Doru Costea has had a 27-year-long career with Romania Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he worked mostly in policy planning and analysis. He was also Secretary of State for Global Affairs. He was successfully Romania's ambassador to Kuwait, Oman, Egypt, also ambassador and permanent representative to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva and China and Mongolia. Ambassador Costea is also a lecturer inter alia at the American University of Cairo, at Columbia University, New York, Tsinghua, and other universities in Beijing and Guangzhou Canton. And he is a frequent guest of postgraduate in Institute in Romania, and become senior associate expert with New Strategy Center in Bucharest. His participation to various international events includes being a panelist at the Atlantic Dialogues hosted by the Policy Center for the New South in 2019. Ambassador Costea is fluent in Arabic, English, and French, and has a PhD in political science with the National School of Political Administrative Studies, Bucharest, on democracy building in the Middle East. But I want to add, I see that Ambassador Costea didn't mention that he was the first president of Human Rights Council, and he was the president who initiated the universal periodical review member states. So he has a great experience of the starting of the Human Rights Council. Then I would pass to present Mrs. Jessica Gottsleben. Okay, sorry. Jessica Gottsleben is a servant leader, lifelong scholar, human rights advocate, and intersectional feminist. She holds a master's degree in justice and security and serves as an information security scholar for the Center for Cyber Safety and Education. She is a 2016 graduate of the Campaign School at Yale University and 2014 inductee to the Order of Pegasus, the most prestigious and significant award attainable at the University of Central Florida, from which she holds 2 bachelor degrees with Burnett Honors College distinction in radio and television broadcast journalism and political science, and a leadership studies certificate. She is a recognized activist against violence of all forms and an abolitionist in the fight to end modern slavery. Her past work also includes serving as a researcher and UNESCO delegate speaker on climate change and sustainability in the Caribbean, a New Leaders Council Fellow, a multimedia journalist and director, a fellow on global peace and security, a U.S. Congressional Fellow on Interdisciplinary Policy, and one of the youngest inaugural Congressional Fellows in Constitutional Law, among other roles. In 2014, she became one of 4 women in the history of the 2nd largest university in the United States to run for student body president. She has also been featured in Bastel Know This Politics and I Know Politics through UN Women, among other outlets. And then I will pass to present Mrs. Ana Paula Barreto. Mrs. Ana Paula Barreto is a program director for AfroResistance in New York. She has a master's in art in international affairs and is a fellow of the United Nations Fellowship Program for People of African Descent. Anna is a researcher on migration, global health, and inequalities with special focus on women and girls of color. Anna has more than 15 years of experience as a human rights professional, working in several countries of the Americas and Africa, doing innovative work on global health and reproductive justice. In 2018, she developed the project analyzing the intersection between economic empowerment in health outcomes of women and children in Ethiopia, as well as the first Black Brazilian Film Festival in the African continent. So I hope I was right with your presentations. Okay, so if you agree, we can pass to this tour de table, to brief tour de table, and to ask you to really, in a very summarized way, say what are the key achievements you consider have been achieved by the UN and by global community in terms of human rights during this 75 years, the key gaps, and what needs to be done, the key recommendation, very rapidly. Thank you very much. And I will pass the floor to Ambassador Doru Costea.
Thank you very much indeed, Director. It is a real challenge to try and say what achievements, gaps, and what might be done in a very short words. I'll try. Achievement, first of all, I think that taking the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as a standard bearer, if you wish, of the whole UN activity in the field is one of the greatest and most consequential steps. Mind you, that declaration is almost as old as the UN itself,
yes,
and still has not lost one iota of its topicalness. Consequently, or the second great achievement is, of course, the Council, which we will talk about later. Again, we all know the Council was the only body. I think there were two bodies that were set up in 2006 since 1945 in the UN system. One of them was the Council. The other one had to do with sanctions. So in such a long span of time, the institution had found it appropriate to give birth to only one other child, so to speak. Gaps, key gaps. I think that one of the most serious gaps is the gap in, or rather the ineffectual educational work on human rights related issues that is performed by the system. When I say a system, I mean UN, including the Council. Awareness is low, and you just mentioned in your introduction one, I did not catch very clearly what, only one reference to human rights or one recommendation or something like that.
One or two, I mean, or
anyway,
three,
the share is very low, isn't it? I mean, it's quite, shall I say, disappointing.
Okay.
Suggestion, what could be done? Of course, we just take the gaps and put what to do in order to bridge them, and we have done it. But besides that, in a very concrete and practical manner, I guess that further reforming, updating, and improving the Human Rights Council is a must. I know there is a process, very active one, very intense one. It doesn't work it is not tremendously successful, I'm afraid, which should make everybody even more determined to go on with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for these very valuable ideas. So we will now pass for a woman. We'll pass, because, you know, in our culture, we give priority to senior people. So we will pass a woman and then another man and then a woman. Okay, so the floor is yours, Mrs. Jessica.
Wonderful. I don't want to cover anything that we might cover in later questions or necessarily cover something that was already mentioned for the sake of efficiency.
As you like, as you like. You may add what has been done, already said.
In terms of key achievements, I think it is positive that the United Nations is listening more to the people, as you mentioned. You've already mentioned that this is really a year of realizing maybe we've listened more to officials than we have those who are truly represented. So I think that actually listening to populations is probably the greatest achievement. It's a little late, but it is the greatest achievement. But I'm having some struggles actually recognizing achievements at large, specifically to this year, because it is really difficult for me to say we're having this anniversary. It's many, many decades, and yet there is still so much violence. We're seeing so much state-sponsored violence. I come from a US perspective, and the United States likes to boast itself quite often, and yet we're seeing state-sponsored genocide, and we're seeing things within our country, and there's, queer purges going on, state-sponsored purges of queer individuals, and so many other things, and the threat of white supremacy is so large and so unrecognized, and the threat of the climate crisis, and so many things that are unrecognized across spectrums for marginalized people. So it's very difficult for me to just be excited about the anniversary and the achievements rather than looking at the large gaps. And I know we're going to address some of it later, but the gaps are largely within the system. And we can address some of that later. But again, I think my suggestions would be that we need to relook at the council itself. We need to look at how the council is set up within the UN, but we largely need to see how populations are truly represented. And I think we've missed some key parts because we forget that human rights is critical to every other component. There is no economic security, there is no general security, there's no other thing unless human rights are at the foundation of that. And I think that has been overlooked in an intersectional capacity. So I'm not going to get too much into it. We can address some of that stuff later, but I think those are the gaps that we need to really look at instead of treating human rights as a secondary component for so long.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And then I will pass the floor to Mr. Khalid Ramli from, yes, please.
Thank you very much. So I concur with the two former panelists about the achievements and the gap, but I would like to add to that regarding the achievements. I would say, if we take into consideration or if we assess a whole period of 75 years, I would say that the establishment of universal norms that apply to everyone on the planet is in itself an achievement. So this universalization of human rights is really something that it's an added value. Plus also the establishment of human rights mechanisms at the international level. You've mentioned the Human Rights Council, but there are also other mechanisms, including treaty bodies and special procedures mandate holders. These are also key international, regardless of the gaps. So we will talk about them later on, maybe. But I can say that these also, it's also an achievement. I would also say the protection of human rights at the individual level. Now we have individuals in every state. So regardless of whether country ratified or adhered to a convention, those people or those individuals can access these mechanisms. And I'm referring here to the special procedures mandate holders. So individuals can submit complaints to these mechanisms, regardless of whether the state has ratified or what we call our principle of the exhaustion of national remedies. Regarding the gaps, yes, there is protection, but protection is still a real gap at the international level. So when you see around us, what's going on right now, there are entrenchments or there are infringements upon the rights, all generations of rights, including the right to life. So we still have insecurity around the world with the wars, with the internal conflicts almost in every continent. And also I would add to the gaps, the lack of mainstreaming the international norms into legislations. We still have this issue. Several states, they do not give priority or supremacy to international standards. They rather prefer what is national. And okay, for us, the international standards, despite the fact that a state may ratify, but for them it's something that it's like a tool, guiding or a guide or something like that. So the international instrument, I'm talking about the binding instrument, are not given the importance and the value added. I would say also the politicization. You have mentioned the Human Rights Council, but it's still a politicized body. So it's a club of states judging each other. That's how it goes in Geneva. And if you, I'm trying, I have to confess first that the question of itself is very challenging. So for us to try to find
No, just have an idea.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
So well, I'm concurring with Mr. Ambassador. So for what can be done is to bridge the gap of the gaps. So like the depoliticization and the reform. I know that there is a reform of the Human Rights Council, but there is also a reform that is called Reform 2020. Unfortunately, there is no fruits now, but I know that it's a process that started in 2012 with Navy Pillay, but it is a process that is still going on.
Thank you so much. I know it is challenging to give this in very rapidly, but I think the key very rapid, just to have an idea. Okay, we will pass now to Anna. Please, Anna, go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Just adding to my colleagues, I think that if we put it in a historical perspective, one of the main, I would say, success of the UN was really to avoid a military confrontation between global powers. This is one success, I would say. Historically, if we think about 1945 and now, and of course, the ambassador is here to really talk about the Universal Periodic Review and also the Human Rights Declaration, and how so many people in the world today can say, and it's also, it's part of our education to teach people that they have rights. This is also an achievement. You can find a little girl in the world that can say, this is my right. It is my right to go to school. This is an achievement as well. Then I'm gonna go for the gaps or maybe the challenges that we are facing. I would say we are moving towards a more polarized world, and that means more challenges to when we talk about multilateralism and the decisions that would take involved more stakeholders. I also think that there is an increase on tensions and military tensions, not necessarily between the global powers, but in the local and national levels, but where the global powers are involved. So this is also another type of confrontation that sometimes is very challenging to the system. And I also think that one of the challenges of our time is the increase in historical economic inequalities that we are seeing. So we are talking about, for the first time in history, a person will become a trillionaire. And what does that mean to the world? And what does that mean that one person will have $1 trillion in wealth? And if we think about resources, if we think about power, if we think about sanctions in a way, what does that mean to the person and to the person that is at the favelas in Brazil? This is what I want us to think about. What does that mean to the people that are not enjoying their human rights? So I'm going to stop here, as this is like a very short beginning of conversation.
Thank you so much. So I know I'm aware that it is not easy to put it very rapidly gaps, but just to have an idea about what is in the head. So I mean the most salient things. So if you agree, I would suggest to pass to the 3 questions. We will try to engage a discussion on these 3 questions. And the first question, just to recall, it is how can the streamlining of the monitoring system of the United Nations enhance respect by member countries for their human rights obligations? As example, could the elevation or the reform or whatever of the Human Rights Council could be a solution? I think that we have, a privilege to have among us Ambassador Costea, who was at the origin of the installment of and the departure of the work of this council and especially the universal review to have a good historical point of view, and he has also a lot of enough time, and we have enough time also to try to assess what has been done and what is the situation now. So if you allow me, we could start with Ambassador Costea. Yes, please.
Yes.
Yes, please. So the first.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I admit I am a little bit not embarrassed, but under pressure because of your very nice words, very kind words on what was done during the second cycle of the Human Rights Council when I had the privilege of being the president. I am very keen on emphasizing that whatever was done during that time was due to a very large extent to the contribution of fellow diplomats that dealt with the famous institutional building. You are all aware of this process. It was something that could be included in several volumes because of the challenges and because of the efforts, and not least due to the creativity of the diplomats and most particularly of the facilitators that dealt with various issues. And I am extremely happy to recall here the contribution of Ambassador Mohammed Lulichki, particularly in the UPR, because he was one of the key elements, key factors, key teachers rather, on younger diplomats of how a square could fit into a circle. And this is what Ambassador Lulichki has done. I do hope, I see here somewhere there on the screen, and I do hope that we will have the opportunity of greeting him in virtual person. Now, coming back to the topic itself, allow me to swiftly recall some fundamentals that I guess will be truly welcome, well, good rather, or useful to remember. One is the human rights are universal. This is more emphasized by the fact, not only because they are human, but look also at the title of our conversation, a shared humanity. It is us, all of us, who have these rights. The importance of this apparently obvious statement, I guess, lies in the fact that while this is true, there are, let's call them smaller universes that make the bigger universe of Earth, of humanity. And I have in mind the various cultural, civilizational, and educational backgrounds against which human rights develop or not, rather against which human rights exist. The UN is the perfect place to see this mingling, interacting, and sometimes clashing of various approaches because of these differences. The second point is that human rights are equal. Of course, what comes immediately to mind is what Kofi Annan said about the great three purposes of the UN: development, security, and human rights. that are given equal weight and attention, and all of them must be underpinned by the rule of law. So, in this respect, the human rights are equal among themselves, while a practical, pragmatic approach calls for separate measures sometimes. And we see, and we just heard again at the beginning of our conversation, that economic and social rights had the first place because particularly of this extremely dramatic and painful crisis that we all live. Now, while admitting this pressure of social and economic rights, we should also keep in mind that actually all rights are equally important. Another thing that I guess should be kept in mind is that human rights are alive. To put it otherwise, they are subject to continuous development, change, and evolution, which means there is nothing like, all right, we've got the job done, let's go home. We have all the human rights observed, khalas. No, there's nothing like that. You can't have that. You don't have, as you don't have ever the opportunity or the possibility to say, we have built democracy, now we go home.
Ambassador, excuse me, you've been the first president of the Human Rights Council to establish this universal periodical review. I suppose it was not easy at the beginning, and I suppose that after all these times, you are in a good position to say whether this monitoring system or this monitoring regime is doing well in terms of pushing member states or making member states abide by their international obligations or not, and what needs to be done for this specific thing.
Thank you very much indeed. The UPR is a unique mechanism, of course. If you discount the similar mechanism in WTO, which is much more hands-on and on which the UPR was inspired, actually. Now, the short answer is that the UPR has performed better than expected and less than wanted. Nobody expected this system to work like that. I mean, there were low expectations of the mechanism to be established at all in the first place. Okay. It was too complicated. It was mission impossible. Well, even the Mission Impossible series proves that it can be done.
Do you think that it needs some tweaks to be more performant now, absolutely. Or it is okay?
You know, it's much more than it was before because it's new. On second, one of the greatest achievements is the interaction between governments and civil society, which is compulsory by the statute of the UPR. And third, the opportunity, the possibility, because it is not always observed, to check your commitments, because now we have several cycles already and countries have committed, we will do this and we will do that. And 4 years or 5 years later, I'm not sure how much, 4 years and a half, I think. They come back and say, we did it. But there are so many people who say, no. Okay. So This is one mechanism is of strengthening the observance, is to keep more severe or closer track of human rights performance.
Do you think there is a need for an institutional upgrading of the Human Rights Council, or this will not be the solution? Not necessarily the solution.
So. Again, a short answer. We know that the reform of the UNO, the whole organization, is something that haunts policy makers, that have been haunting policy makers for years. The Security Council, some 5 years after it was established, was called to be reformed. And how long is that now? 7 years? So what I mean is that the Human Rights Council needs to be part and parcel of the whole reform of the UN.
Perfect.
But it doesn't excuse the Council to wait for the reform of the UN. It needs to reform itself, and keep in mind that at one time or another, it should fit in a new UN, UN 0.2.
Okay, thank you very much. So can we pass to Anna, for example, if you are ready, Anna? Okay, on this issue, so I mean the international human rights monitoring regime, whether it is functioning well or not, and how to improve it. Same questions.
Yeah, thank you. Building on the comments of the ambassador, I think, so I'm going to speak for the perspective also as someone that work for the UN in different agencies, as well as someone that represents civil society right now. And I want to push for a comment here for also colleagues. I think there are two things here. I understand that to have a reform in the UN, it's very important because, in my view, it's very headquarters centric. And then for the people from the global south, it's very difficult to go to Geneva. It's very difficult to have, like, which NGO can have money and time to have an office in Geneva, to have staff in Geneva, to travel to Geneva. So it also, from the civil society perspective, also the people moving the agenda are the big NGOs, not necessarily the most vulnerable communities. So for them to arrive in Geneva, it's a whole complex situation. They have to do partnerships with the big ones. They have to be in agreement with the United Nations for pay tickets, hotels. It's a whole situation that takes like a year to arrange. From the UN perspective, as a former person working there, I also view that throughout the years, the reforms are being vocal by member states, but the actual things happening are dismantling of positions, especially low-level positions. Now we see an increased number of consultants that don't have like works benefits, for example. The UNV is a big example of how now the UNVs receive much less than 10 years ago, but doing the same type of work. So at the same time, I also would like to hear for my colleagues that how we can also think this reform that is now focused on the structuring of the workers. So having less workers, having less protection for the workers inside the UN. When we think about the high level positions, they're pretty much there. There is very not big changes. So then proportionally, we are still affecting the most vulnerable inside the system still. Another thing that I would like to say, thinking about the reforms and how to connect it to more protection and promotion of human rights in the countries, that this has to be a connection with the national mechanisms of protection. So how we can make sure that the national mechanism would be the one that would be independent, that would be doing, thinking about the review of human rights, doing the work of protection in a way. And when we also think about that the word is also at the same time shifting a little bit to the right, not only 1 or 2 countries, but a lot of countries in the world, unfortunately. So then when we think about the independence of national mechanisms, how we can make sure that they will be truly independent when we are seeing an increase of the number of the states that are not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a human rights agenda as the core of their administration. So I wanna present more questions for us to think about ways rather than have like an answer here.
Thank you, Anna. So we will pass to the perspective of Mr. Khalid Ramli. So, okay, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Well, what have been said, I will just add maybe another perspective. I mean, for the streamlining, I think that in addition to the reform, which is a must, as it's been said by His Excellency the Ambassador, I would say that what I mentioned earlier, that the depoliticization of the Human Rights Council is a major step towards the reform. You cannot keep a body same-minded, if it's between quote, stakeholders judging each other. This is one. The second, the membership itself should be reviewed. We have seen recently, I mean, in the media, so much criticism to the membership of the Human Rights Council. Many countries with, I mean, I'm not going to say a poor, but a severely poor human rights record have been elected to the Human Rights Council. I'm not going to mention names, but I'm sure you know some states. The UPR itself should be also reformed. I'm taking the example of Morocco. We received like 244 recommendations under the UPR 3, session 3, which was in 2017. And we found that there is a kind of redundancy. And I mean, for example, I can give an example because I'm working in a national human rights institution, and we are more engaged in anti-torture practices. And there was recently in Morocco the establishment of a national preventive mechanism against torture, which is provided for by the OPCAT, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. We received like more than 10 recommendations saying the same thing. You cannot take it this way. I can give the example of the ratification of the protocol, for example, on economic and social rights, like dozens of recommendations saying the same thing. I think there should be a reform of the outcome document of because this is the most important tool that we have at the end of the day. It's the outcome. It's like the roadmap for the reforms, and then it's the roadmap based on which we will be assessed after 4 years and a half. But I'm saying, because I'm trying to respond to the question that was put and that was sent earlier to the panelists. I'm saying it from another perspective. Yes, there is what we seek, the promotion and the protection of human rights. It cannot be done at the level of the United Nations. There should be a political will at the national level of each state. And this political will goes with strong institutional, legislative, constitutional, and policy reforms. These things should be set up in every state. I would give example concerning the institutional, for example, reforms at the level of states. There should be a government entity dealing with, for example, reporting to the United Nations treaty bodies. There is so much backlog in terms of reporting. So we don't know how the situation of human rights looks like in a specific country. There are countries with a delay of 20 years. There was no report there. So there should be, and I think the establishment of a government entity specialized in reporting and in coordinating the public human rights policies at the national level is very important. Two, and always in terms of the institutional reforms, I think that also national human rights institutions have been playing a key role. And His Excellency, the Ambassador, have mentioned stakeholders. National human rights institutions come second after states and then civil society. But national human rights institutions can play a major role in influencing the national realities, the national legislation. They can influence policies, they can influence laws, they can influence also practices. There are many examples, so I'm not going to give specific examples, but I would say, for example, here in the Human Rights Council, there were major successes, for example, in terms of the establishment of the Truth and Equity and Reconciliation Commission here in Morocco. The National Human Rights Institution was behind that with their recommendation. A reform, for example, of the military code in order not to bring civilians before military courts. It was the National Human Rights Institution. A launch of a whole migration policy in Morocco. It was thanks to a report by the National Human Rights Council. So what I'm trying to say is that national human rights institutions are new and a key national stakeholders that we should reinforce. States should establish or reinforce, because now at the global level, there are about 120 national human rights institutions, almost 70 something in line with the Paris principles, which are the international rules that govern the function of national human rights institutions. Okay. So this is sorry.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So that's, in my mind, this is something very important. Two things that states need to take into consideration. The first one, I'm going, if I'm going beyond my time, please just let me know. I would stop down.
Just finish with the two recommendations or two ideas, great. Because we have still two points to discuss.
Okay, so the last point is that so national human rights institutions discharge their mandate, which is the protection of human rights, promotion of human rights, but also prevention of violations of human rights. Several national human rights institutions have now what we call the national preventive mechanisms against torture. More than the majority, more than half, more than 35 NHRIs in the world are hosting preventive mechanism. So states need to reinforce the legislative framework of these national human rights institutions in such a way that these NHRIs should be independent. They should remind the state, they should stop state, they should speak to the state and tell to the state, stop, you are wrong here, you are good here and you are wrong here. So we are not civil society. So we are like we are playing a bridging link between civil society and the state. We should be objective. Two, national human rights institutions should be provided with adequate human and financial resources so that they can do their job. Because it's not they are sitting in their offices, but they need to go to the field. National fields through, I can say, regional, for example, branches. Here in Morocco, we have 12 regional branches working in different parts of the country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Khalid. So you think that to improve the international human rights monitoring, there is a need also to act locally. So the national branches, if I can see, could be performing very well. Okay, that's very clear. And now so just before passing the floor to Jessica, we have still two ideas to discuss: the conditionality and the vulnerabilities and human rights. So I will ask you for the next tour, the table around the question, to be more brief because we are ahead of time. We have. Okay, so Jessica, the floor is yours.
I just want to say that I appreciate the sentiments made by the wonderful colleagues that I'm so honored to be on this panel with. And I'd like to amplify those sentiments because I do agree with all the sentiments that have been made. I think there need to be more resources. I couldn't agree more, because telling states that they need to do things and then not actually holding ourselves accountable as to how we make sure they have the resources to do them is negligent. And I agree that in terms of how we're monitoring at the outcome point, I think that is a major piece, because I agree, we need to reform the UN as an organization as a whole. We need to reform a lot of our councils, not just the Human Rights Council. We need to reform the membership of the Human Rights Council, whether we bring the Human Rights Council up to the level of other councils or not. If the member states that are on the council are not actually participating in trying to protect human rights, and they have human rights violations themselves, then there's a severe issue as to how they're able to hold any other member state accountable. If you are violating human rights, but you are sitting on a Human Rights Council, it's a significant problem, and I can't emphasize that enough. And I agree that at the national levels, we are seeing a large push to the right, and that is one of my greatest concerns in terms of monitoring, in terms of white supremacy and state violence and other things, that it doesn't just go to one component. Like, we'll answer this in later questions, but if you're a marginalized person, like myself, I'm queer, I'm a woman, I'm disabled, I have the privilege of being white. But if you are at those intersections, all of the national policies that are not in alignment with international standards will impact you. And to answer our direct questions, the streamlining of the monitoring systems is critical, because we don't have this. Almost all of the member states and even human rights organizations have reported back saying that there's a duplication of work, there's a backlog of reports from states, there's an excessive burden of reporting, there's a proliferation of the mechanisms, there's no harmony. There's been a request to have a treaty body that is separate and unified to stand above the others. There's such a severe lack of accountability, and it almost seems like we're making it difficult to ensure that human rights are upheld. And we shouldn't make it difficult. It should not be difficult to report. It should not be difficult to track. And yes, I think that elevating the Human Rights Council status to a main body would do something, but I don't think that that's the solution. There are so many little components that each of my colleagues touched on. And that's, I think, what our main issue is. It's not just one thing. It's not just streamlining the monitoring system. It's not just elevating the council.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a request from member states that don't even sit on the Human Rights Council to do an independent monitoring body just for, and I will name names because maybe I have less fear, but China. There are so many violations going on in so many places, and everyone is too scared to hold each other accountable, and that is becoming a severe issue because of the politicization. And I would say that if we genuinely care about human rights, and if that is at the core of what the UN does across all of our councils and across anything that we do, then we have to look at why we're doing what we do, and just we have to hold the member states to a higher standard, because this is, I sound more pessimistic, but I'm just, or maybe I'm idealistic, but I want everyone to care more about what the ambassador said about human rights truly being universal, and that when we are letting people slip through the cracks and we have all of these gaps, and that certain member states are not, like, there are smaller states that are doing a better job than larger states. There are just so many lack of resources, so many little gaps, and those at the margins can't fix it. That's just the main thing. Those at the margins can't fix it. And we're putting the burden on them. And I think that education and awareness and a lot of other things need to be done. We'll discuss those in later questions, so I don't want to get too far into it, but there's just so much that needs to be done past just simplistic monitoring or where we move the council to. There are so many human rights violations still going on, and there needs to be some reforms that are much larger than just the ones we're talking about, and we need to take newer developed issues in the current year that we're in. We need to take the issues we're seeing in 2020, and we need to put those across everything and be much more intersectional.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers everything.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So, you know, this Human Rights Council haven't been an easy issue, and still is not an easy issue. You have countries and superpowers who who can just get out and boycott. So it is a it is an issue of international law and international community. So the consensus, the politics, many factors play. So it is very subtle game, between brackets game, not in the positive sense of game. What is possible, what could be done, could not be done. So we try to manage all these. So if you allow, we can pass to rapidly to the two remaining questions. We have the issue of conditionalities. I mean, do you think that, and it is better, I think, to be very brief. And the first issue, the issue of the conditionality. Do you think that conditionality in the strategic cooperation, economic cooperation, etc., should be introduced or reinforced, that human rights should be respected as even in the contracts or the convention of cooperation between countries or multilateral agreements, or even within the Bretton Woods institutions and all these international economic and financial governance institutions. Do you think that issue of conditioning international cooperation with respect of human rights could be a doable thing, could be an efficient thing, very rapidly? Okay, let's start with a woman now. We will start with Anna, who she is laughing. Okay, Anna.
I was just thinking how we can be succinct on such a complex question. Well, let's think about the EU, for example. The EU is an important example that use conditionality on a lot of its economic agreements. Well, some research shows that it is very effective depending on how is the relationship between the two parties, meaning how dependent or independent they are from themselves. So countries that are more dependent on the EU and the strategic partnership with them would be effective on the conditionalities, meaning that improving whatever the conditionality is, can be more laws, more policies, more resources. And then on the other end, as more independent as they are, the less effective. But then I think that here there is also a question of, does a country has the power or has the right to influence the national a national agenda of another country. And then here, I also want to point out a different example. So it would be interesting for us to think, if we think about the African countries, the same situation doing economic relationships with the EU, if they as a bloc will say, our conditionality is ending racial discrimination in your countries against our citizens, how this would be viewed by the international community? Would that be viewed as the same way as we see the EU acting, using economic relations as a diplomatic tool, or this would be viewed differently? So I wonder here if the real means is the promotion and protection of human rights, or this is more like a power dynamic, and that is a country determine what is the agenda of another country. And I also think, like, if there is a country, like if there is a country where the specific conditionality is not a pressing issue on that country, but it's doing an agreement with the EU, does that mean that that country will have to put out resources and think about and create an agenda to promote and protect that specific situation that for them maybe is not a pressing issue? So here I would like to put out some thoughts on that.
Okay, so it could be useful maybe, but we should be aware that this could degenerate toward imposing external agenda. Okay, so we can pass to Khalid if you would like to contribute on that. Khalid, you are on mute.
I see. For me also, it's a difficult question,
Yeah, okay.
And the answer is a bit. But I will reply as a human rights defender or stakeholder, and I would say yes, it should be. The conditionality should be there. Why? Because the simple reply is that human rights is in every aspect of our life. So we cannot imagine a measure or a partnership or a convention without the human rights approach being integrated in it. So even at the national level now, when we are talking, for example, about the development of the financial law or the financial act, people are talking, although, governments do not say that, well, this is a human rights based, but if you do an analysis, the word or the term is not there. If you do the analysis, if you talk, for example, about, take the example of Morocco, we are talking about social aspects. The majority of the budget is for social aspects, for example, for the health, for education, that's human rights. So, but I would say that for example, the free trade agreements, which is the form between the countries, the human rights approach should be there. And there should be a balance. States, while doing it, there should be some awareness of the possible threats or dangers that a free trade agreements may pose on those who might be left behind. The most vulnerable groups, the small vendors, for example, the street vendors, for example. I'm giving the example, of course, of those people who are in small shops, and this shop is the unique source of income. So you cannot do like a free trade agreements that would, destroy their living. And this is the reality. This is the truth. So the economic partnerships should take into consideration the human rights approach. I would also talk, because now they are talking and there is too much discussions about this issue. Partnerships and business and human rights. It's very complicated from a political perspective, but from a human rights perspective, yes, it's there. Now there is a binding instrument, a binding convention. It is being discussed by the Human Rights Council. Here in Morocco, as a Human Rights Council, we participated in the debate there. We chair the group of national human rights institutions, the group of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. But our input and contribution is to was to find a place for national human rights institutions to play in this binding instrument, which is a redress mechanism. Now the binding, the last version of the draft, which was available in August 2020, it is clear in the draft that national human rights institutions may be redress mechanism, the mechanism de recours. So this is something very important, but also at the level of the OCDE, the Organization of the Economic and yeah, they are talking about other concepts, which is the responsible business conduct, which is totally different. Mm-hmm. We were talking in the past about the RSE, or the Responsabilité Sociale des Entreprises, or the social corporate responsibility. Yeah. Now, they no longer talk about that. They are talking about the responsible business conduct from a human rights perspective. If you want to establish an investment, a business in every way, it should take into consideration you cannot, for example, do an investment which impacts on the livings of the local communities. Those who are living, I'm saying whatever, those who are living, for example, in forests, in their living, in their milieu, and you come because that place suits you, and you establish your business, and you don't take into consideration the right to life or their climate rights. So this is something I think very important. Maybe there is a need to devote just like another session just to speak about this issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Khalid. This was very very enriching. And now we pass to Jessica briefly, and then to Ambassador Doru Costea. Yes, Jessica.
Yes, I can definitely keep it brief. I mean, I think something that some of my colleagues have mentioned, and I feel like I mentioned it a little bit, but when we're looking at, when I've mentioned those at the margins, I heard the mention of rural, and I think rural populations, indigenous populations are not taken into account. And that's a major issue, not just when we're talking about strategic economic partnerships, but as a whole, we hear indigenous voices consistently silenced. And a lot of complaints come from indigenous populations in regards to our treaty systems and other things. So my answer to this question is yes, absolutely. The conditionality of human rights in strategic economic partnerships is an incentive for human rights protection and promotion. And the reason I say that is because I am an anti-slavery advocate and an abolitionist, and I work in fair trade policy. And this is overlooked consistently. So even if we are just looking at the aspects of slavery and how fair trade policy works, if you're talking about business to business, not even if we're looking at member states here for economic partnerships, but just a business to business perspective, there are many businesses and organizations that will not work with each other unless each of them has fair trade policy, essentially meaning that slavery is not utilized, that is not present. And I am someone who often promotes a circular economy, for not just at the human rights level, but that, that impacts so many other things in terms of sustainability. So the reason I say that conditionality is it serves as a contract between member states and larger bodies to say, we won't work with you, we will not work together if we know that genocide is present, if we know that torture is largely present, if we know that slavery is present, and that you are either state sponsoring it or you just don't care about it. Because if there is that push from other states, other member states to say, we don't want to work with you, you are going to be economically impacted because the things that you are doing are violating human rights, that does have an incentive for member states to really look at what they do and decide that our economy is going to be impacted if we don't care about human rights. If slave labor is something that we're fine with, if genocide is something that we're fine with, if human lives don't mean anything to us, then maybe, you know, human lives make up our economy. So maybe we should care more about them if we want other member states to work with us. And for me, it's like taking fair trade policy that's very business to business and upgrading that to state, saying we will not partner, you know, body to body, we will not partner, we won't work with you. We don't want to partake in something because we hold ourselves to a higher standard. If you don't care about a circular economy or these other things, if you just saying that if you don't value human rights, we don't want to partake in that because we as a member state hold ourselves to a higher regard. And that pushes each member state to really evaluate what they allow to happen if they want their economy to keep going. But that's a larger discussion for a different time as to how we value human lives in how we look at our individual economies.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So maybe the idea is there is kind of minimum standards that every state should respect. And also we have the importance of not also politicizing human rights to impose agenda to other states who are in need. So it's all international issues are always an issue of looking for balance, for equilibrium. And then we'll try to have the perspective of diplomats. So Ambassador, yes, the floor is yours on conditionality and human rights and strategic cooperation.
Thank you very much. I fully agree from the diplomat's perspective. Striking a balance, maintaining an equilibrium is something like a genetic pre-ordained conditionality, by the way. That's the point of whole diplomacy, to strike balances and to make impossible ends meet. Now, the short, again, as short as possible, answer to the question is yes, conditionalities for economic cooperations are vital. Caveats, however, care should be given, because when you impose such conditions, you need to be fully aware of the consequences. Who will get hurt because of those conditions? So perversely, conditionalities go hand in hand with sanctions. You don't meet the condition, you are sanctioned. Not by another decision, merely by cutting up the provision or the provider or the whatever you are supposed to receive because of that economic strategic cooperation. Now, having said that, I'm very happy that Ms. Barreto mentioned the EU, because it is the talk of the town. Maybe not necessarily in Brazil, certainly not in the US today. But I'm sure that everybody has heard at least about the famous Article 7, which is a very strong instrument to be used against those who abuse human rights, rule of law, and a lot of other regulations while being a member state of the EU. And this is something very important. It is now a huge debate with the EU to implement a conditionality between full observance and proved observance, not only declared observance, checked and rechecked observance of human rights and the rule of law, and resources in order to have the multi-annual financial framework. And it is almost 2 trillion euros for the next 7 years. It's not exactly a pittance, quite a lot of money. Having said that, I guess that when human rights are about and talking about conditionalities, when some things come first to mind, like resources. One of our distinguished colleagues mentioned that country who is under those conditions may not have the resources to do what is demanded of her. All right, here comes the international cooperation in the specific field. Here you are, here you have some resources to use for whatever you don't have and you can't afford to have. Priorities, it's not my priority. Well, let's see. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it is your priority. You don't want it to be, but it is nonetheless. And of course, last but not least, is the institutional capability. Because we do not have this or that institution. All right, you need to set it up. Again, when you put forward conditions, you need to look at whether they are implementable. Otherwise, it's the value of conditionality goes to the drain.
Okay. So the idea is that this conditionality should serve human rights rather than hit human rights or basic human rights in some countries. So we have the last point, which is about innovative mechanisms that could be imagined or contemplated or examined in order to enhance the protection of vulnerable sections of the society. We know that with this pandemic, the world became very aware, because it was blatantly clear that our world is unequal. Our world suffers huge inequalities. If you see the maps of contaminations of the COVID and the rapidity of the spread of this COVID, I mean, you can, on the map, you will see areas where highly populated, where are slums, where are poverty. I mean, the rate is skyrocketing, and this is very grave, etc., etc. In communities where there are distancing and where they can dedicate, for example, a room for somebody who is infected, etc., they could manage. But this can never be managed in a slum, for example, when you have a family of 5 or 7 or whatever in 2 rooms, or they cannot dedicate a room, for example, to isolate someone who is contaminated. So this is just a picture which is very, very talking, but the idea of inequalities. Our world suffers from inequality. And the Secretary General, this, some weeks ago, had, on the Mandela Day, he had made a lecture on inequality in the world. And this is a key issue for human rights. So inequality is related to, to disability, related to gender, related to, social belonging, or to ethnicity. It also relates to history, because people, for example, of African descent are less favorized than others in the US, for example, or in other, or even in Latin America. People who suffered colonization, for example, are already suffering from the weight of this colonization in their after the independence, etc. So how the UN could put in motion or could invent innovative mechanisms to improve the protection of vulnerable people. Could you please give a response to that in, let's say, maximum 5 minutes, 4 minutes, so we can be in time, because we did a lot of time. So in 3 minutes for everyone, okay? Okay, so we will start with Khalid. If you are ready, otherwise we can.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for me, again, it's a two-way action that needs to be taken. So there is an action that need to be taken at the UN level, but there is also an action that needs to be taken at the local and national level. I would start with the national level, and I would say, since we are talking about mechanisms or innovative mechanisms, I would say that the strengthening of existing mechanisms or the establishment of mechanisms is very important. Why? Because now we have mechanisms, the level of states. So we have government entities, we have national institutions, we have also other mechanisms that are provided by the United Nations, but they are not operating in countries. I would add that because you mentioned in your question 3 vulnerable groups: women, children, and persons with disabilities. For this, at least these 3 categories, there are mechanisms that states are hesitating to establish. So the first one is the mechanisms on the rights of persons with disabilities. So it is provided by Article 33 of the Convention, of the Disability Rights Convention. So there are only few in the world, except sometimes in Europe, you have what they call in the European Union, the equality bodies, but sometimes they do not cover, they only focus on gender equality and equality between men and women, and they do not take into consideration the disability dimension, which is very unique, and it should be a specific approach to tackle and to address the issue of persons with disabilities in different states, regardless of whether they are developed or developing. The second one is the child redress mechanism. This is also very important. So it was mentioned in the General Comment 2 of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the United Nations Committee, but only few states have established this mechanism. And this mechanism is very important because it would allow children to come up with complaints. Yeah, we were talking about the hearing, how we give hearing to everyone, and the United Nations survey and everything. So, but usually children, they have their dads, parents, or guardians, legal guardians, who go for a complaint, but children, they do not speak. I mean, this child redress mechanisms is specific for children. So we need to talk to children and to listen to them, what they have as complaints, and we take into consideration that now domestic violence is a phenomenon which exists in every corner of the world, and children are involved, whether directly or indirectly. Sometimes it's conjugal, between the husband and the wife, but the child is indirectly affected with this phenomenon of domestic violence. The third mechanism is the mechanisms of parity or of equality between men and women. This is also very important, but it should not be only women. It should also include all other groups in the society, because it's an anti-discrimination body provided for by Article 14 of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
So for example, here practically you suggest that, for example, inclusion of youth, inclusion of people from rural areas, from defavorized areas, something like that.
Vulnerable groups is it's becoming longer. So in addition to the group, we have also prisoners. And here I'm coming to another mechanism which is important, and it deals mainly, not exclusively, but mainly with prisoners, which is the National Preventive Mechanism. This is very important in the sense that it's very unique. It plays a preventive role. It is not protection, but it's prevention. So you intervene before the violence, the violation occurs. You go to the prison. You see how the prison looks like. You see whether training, whether awareness raising, for example, is needed for those who are responsible. Law enforcement officials. So you create an environment which is a human rights friendly. So this is prevention. So this is also needed. So
thank you so much, Khalid, Thank you so much. So we will pass to either Jessica or Anna, who is ready.
I'm ready if that's all right. That's
Okay, yes, please.
I mean, again, I want to amplify the comments made by my colleague because I absolutely agree with the things that you said. I don't want to repeat them, but I do agree. I think first and foremost, we need to, like you said, it's human rights friendly, and we need to be at a preventative approach so that, you know what I mean, this isn't about mitigating where we're at. We should be focusing on preventing human rights violations. I think the first thing we really need to do is try to decolonize the mechanisms that we already have. I think decolonization should be at the forefront because that puts human rights at the forefront of the mechanisms that we already have. I think that we need to look at how we rank the way that human rights are reported. So I know that the Universal Human Rights Index and a variety of other things allow us to look at human rights in each of the member states and in different countries. But if we want to look intersectionally, if we want to look at the most vulnerable, then just saying gender or just saying children or just saying disabled people does not look at the intersection across those. Because if we're giving those equal weight versus realizing that there could be, you know, a Black, queer, disabled child in a severely economically disadvantaged area, and there's so many components in that, and that child is not going to be able to report directly to the United Nations, that's where we should be looking at finding the things that are the gaps that are falling through. I think that we need to look at how the reporting is going between different treaty-based bodies and different committees, because we have each of these committees for different components of human rights. But are we really streamlining what goes across those, which would incentivize each of the groups that we're talking about? The incorporation of the SDGs, I think, is a major part of this. The SDGs at large cover all of these aspects, and I feel like the SDGs were promoted as such a big thing and then kind of separated. There's so much separation that just it doesn't work. Trying to hit all of these facets, again, cross-sectional intersectionality, and how we look at, if we are looking at just the climate crisis, then we see every single marginalized group that's impacted at the human rights level, and that needs to be ranked for countries in how they're managing that element, because that covers more than one group. We need to be essentially publicizing. I know we've talked about awareness and education. Children need to know, like, not just everyone needs to know, but if we're focusing on the most vulnerable, children need to know that they have human rights, that they have rights, and education is a huge component of that. But to also publicize even just the Human Rights Council complaint procedure to the general public, to make these things more accessible, because accessibility is our main issue. If those who are the most vulnerable don't have the accessibility to actually report and make complaints, then are we actually serving them? What is the purpose of having a complaint system? I think we need to better engage civil society and non-governmental organizations, and to establish people's committees and youth committees that are made up of those who are actually represented. Because I mean, my question would be, how many disabled people are actually sitting on any of our committees that deal with the rights of persons with disabilities? Do we have children's voices should be heard on committees that handle children? The elimination of racial discrimination, is it truly representative? Do we have Afro-Indigenous voices represented? If we don't have committees that actually involve the people, then that right there is an issue with our mechanisms, because that just means we have a very colonized set of mechanisms. It doesn't actually represent those who are there. And I think for innovation, and as someone who does information security, I think we need to also look at how either we're interpreting, but also how we're incorporating information communication technologies in these different things, because the most vulnerable either don't have access or can be harmed by the different advancements in technology that we're seeing. And I think that that is also a major component. We need to look at how we are allowing those to have access to report. Or do we even have something that truly monitors how ICT, how the Internet of Things, how new advancements in technology can harm human rights or can advance human rights? Are we monitoring this for the most vulnerable people? So there are just so many new things we could do to allow everyone to truly access seeing whether their human rights are being upheld to the same standard as someone else and letting them know that they have those. I hope that that answers the question properly, but I want to see people, the general populace and children and the most vulnerable elevated to the same level as those who serve in higher positions or who have been elected to those positions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you. So we will pass the floor to Ambassador Doru on the same, Doru Costea on the same question.
Thank you. It is both a rather focused and specific question on a very clear field which calls for special expertise in this. And our previous colleagues have largely demonstrated their full knowledge of the field. So I'd like to restrain myself because I'm feeling humbled by their knowledge, by their approach, and make two remarks. Perhaps before talking about innovative mechanisms, it would be useful to take a closer look at existing mechanisms to see what works and what not, because they are obviously not working in the same way everywhere. Consequently, if a mechanism somewhere does not exist at all, one would know from looking around what could work because it had elsewhere, and clone it or adapt it to the specific circumstances of the respective place. Again, awareness of authorities and civil society is of the essence, and I think we have just heard very concrete remarks on this issue from Mrs. Gottsleben. And last, the second and last thing, I guess that the category of vulnerable persons has also developed, has changed, has acquired new incomers, so to speak. What I have in mind, for instance, is children whose parents are away, are abroad, have emigrated. We have a problem in Romania with that because there are some 2 million Romanians who work elsewhere in the EU member states, but their children are here in Romania. And they are raised by their grandpa and grandma who are not exactly in the prime of their youth. Are they, honestly speaking, the money that comes from father and mother away are definitely useful. Obviously, they do not starve to death, but they do not have what everybody knows they should have, a parent. And hence, we have a very clear problem. We are not used to this. It is very new. But multiply this at the scale of 250 or 80 million internal migrants in China. There you are. Because most of those children cannot accompany their parents because of the hukou system. And you know very well what I'm talking about. happily enough, the authorities have become aware of this and are doing things about it. Slowly, inshallah, they will make it at the end. But until then, it's a long way. So look at what we have and try to improve it and use it to the maximum ability, and to keep put more resources into awareness raising at the level of government and civil society, because to introduce, to present the civil society as the white knight in the shining armor, while the bad guy is the government, is a recipe for disaster. Even if the government is not performing, and or the civil society is fledgling, they should partner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And now we say in Arabic, ختامها مسك. That means the end is with misk. Misk is kind of perfume, traditional. It's a saying in Arabic. So it's not we are not at the ختامها, we are not at the end, because we still will have Ambassador Lulishki, who will join us in some. Okay, he is joining us. So before we can hear from Ambassador Lulishki, I will give the floor to Anna on these third items to hear the perspective from Brazil and Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. Adding to the colleagues, I think that sometimes as human rights professionals, we get very focused on the laws, and the law has to be perfect, and the law has to say that. But a law does not necessarily mean transformation in the life of the people on the ground. And I think sometimes we forget that. So I also want to say that innovation is really shifting. And here I agree with Jessica that this is the decolonization, because we are focused so much on the legal instruments that in our mind we imagine that will be automatically transformed to the life of people. And this is just not the reality. So we still need a UN that is more focused on the people. And here, as our innovation, I would like to suggest that the meetings will be itinerant. So every year it could be in a different country, in a different community. People don't have money to go to Geneva or to go to New York. So that means that the agenda is always the same, because we are hearing the same voices. So if we really would like to hear different voices and the voices of the people that are left behind, we have to reach them, and not expecting them to reach us in Geneva. So that's my final words here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.